Check 1, 2, 3. So you guys should be able to hear me now. Oh, nice haircut. You guys are so nice. This is my let me change it back over to my screen. So this is my favorite part about these streams, when I sit here and wait awkwardly for everybody to join. I need to come up with a good joke. Actually, I do have a good joke. Just give me 1 second. I know exactly what I'll show you guys while we wait to start. If I can find it. I ran across what is potentially one of the most humorous comics I've ever seen in my life. Okay, I found it. Let me switch over to my screen. So for anybody that's just joining us, we're looking at a hilarious comic while everybody logs on. I've looked at this probably like 10 times since I discovered it at like sometime after midnight this week. And every time it gets more funny to me. So, yeah. Okay, I'm going to check my messages real quick. Just make sure we don't have anybody trying to get on, having problems. Oh, we got a new somebody that wants a critique. Let me go back to there. Can you please read it out loud in Yoda's voice? That would complete the experience. Good dishes. I wonder if they have like an online dictation thing that you can actually type and it'll read it like Yoda. Sometime after class, I'll look that up and see if that exists. Because that would be worth experiencing at least once in a lifetime. I just love a kindred spirit Yoda finds. It's so good. It reminds me of another joke, but I'll save that for another streaming day when we have to wait for everybody to sign on. Okay, we'll give everybody 20 more seconds or so, and then we will get started. Alrighty, let's do this. So, welcome everyone. I was going to ask if anybody's having issues, but if you're here and seeing and hearing me, you're the ones who are not having issues. So, in a few minutes, I'll go back and check my email just to make sure we're all here. But for now, let's do this thing. Hope you had a good Memorial Day and weekend. And hope you actually are tuning in now and not extending your weekend. But yeah, if you have any questions, like I say, do use the chat so we can have a little bit of bi-directional communication. It's very helpful that way. It lets me not have to talk at you guys the entire time, and it lets you participate in your college education. So we have a few things to do today. Let me go back to my screen, and I think we'll probably start with Canvas, I think. So I think everybody is doing pretty good at staying on top of things for the most part. You guys all mostly got your quizzes in and your assignment in. I had the assignment set with a expiration or a due date a little bit earlier, and so I moved that to 11:59 again to avoid public outcry, and that seems like everybody got that in. So I do want to do the critique. We'll probably save that towards the end because I don't know exactly how long some of this other stuff will take. So for now, let's talk about exposure since that's what's going on today. And then again, same thing as last week. On Friday the 31st, you'll have your exposure quiz and your exposure assignment due. I do want to talk about a little bit about the last quiz. There were 2 questions on there that were the most commonly missed. One of them was me trying to trick you a little bit, asking what directly affects depth of field. And we talked about how sensor size, even though it's kind of the way everyone talks about depth of field, if you've read photography forums or anything, sensor size does not directly affect depth of field. So if that's confusing to you, maybe ask me why at some point, or maybe I'll bring it up in class and we'll try and talk about that. I'll find a better way to visually illustrate it. I kind of tried to do that before, but I don't think the explanation was awesome because there were a fair few of you that got that one wrong. So we'll talk about depth of field as it relates to sensor size at some point, and I'll see if I can find some better way to explain that. Yeah, and then the other one was, let me see real quick what the other question was. I made a little note of it. See if I can find it here. So yeah, the other question that a fair amount of people seem to struggle with was the rule of thirds question. So like I mentioned in class, to me that's not the most important rule of composition. It might be the most sort of belabored rule of composition. Lots of people will beat the rule of thirds like a dead horse, like it's just the easy thing to go to say this is where you put things in the frame. I don't think it's really, though, an extremely important rule. We'll look at some of your work today when we do the critique, and you guys can kind of see who followed the rule of thirds and who didn't, and how much it really affects your perception of the quality of the shot. So, in fact, let's just go over all, since I've got it open, we'll just go over all of this real quick. So the rule of thirds, again, that is not the most important rule in composition, though it is one quote-unquote rule of composition. Cropping at blank often looks awkward. So I think most of you did pretty well with this. I feel like a few people would select shins over like joints. So shins, again, because the shin is between 2 joints, right? The knee and the ankle. Usually it looks okay to crop somewhere along the shin. You don't generally have too much of a problem with that. It doesn't look like a foot got cut off. So taking lots of photos is an excellent way to improve on finding dynamic and interesting compositions. So I wonder if this was a little bit confusing to some of you because I talked about that intentional versus incidental. So if that is confusing at all, this isn't necessarily advocating just like holding down your shutter button and just spray triggering exposures all over, like just trying to take pictures of tons of stuff just for the sake of taking pictures. But this is saying if you stay in one spot that's easy and convenient, you might miss the thousands of other opportunities that exist at all those other points of view, right? So a few of you I think got confused on that one, but the whole message behind this question is to encourage you to try new things and move your camera around. Again, get it low, get it high, get it anywhere you can that is not where the normal person sort of looks at the world from. So again, we talked about this one, which two of these directly affect depth of field. So basically the short of it that I can say right now without us taking too much time with this question is the sensor size does affect it in the sense that you will reframe the subject to get the subject to fit in the frame the same as you want them to, or as you want it to, on a crop sensor versus a full frame camera. So because the sensor size changes and your field of view changes, you change your proximity to the subject, right? That's what's actually changing depth of field. But again, the only things that directly affect that depth of field are this distance to subject, right? And that aperture entrance pupil. So again, I need to find a good way to illustrate that because it is kind of a confusing thing, especially in a beginning photo class, but because that's so misunderstood online and stuff, I feel like if you can walk away from your university education with at least that one principle under your belt, then you can go and correct the internet and save the world. So which focal length would make the subject's nose look larger relative to their ears? So I went back on this one and gave you guys some extra points because my motivation behind this question was for you guys just to pick one answer, right? To pick the lowest focal length because that would make the subject's nose look the largest, right, of these options. Some of you picked 30 millimeter, and if you picked 15 as well, I gave it to you because both of these are fairly wide focal lengths. So a 30 millimeter lens will make your nose look larger than your nose would look relative to your ears in real life. So I went back and upped the points a little bit on that if you guys missed that one. But yeah, so that's the quiz. Like I say, it's nothing too tricky, but I hope again that you guys sort of understand the concepts behind those things. And if you have any other questions about it, let me know. So if I come back to the calendar, let's look at the exposure topic since that's what we'll be dealing with mostly this week. And let me do a quick check of my messages because I think we had somebody having a hard time getting in. Let me just send the link. And okay, so that should be all caught up. All right, so if we come to today, so if Brian's listening, here's a major critique I have of Canvas. So let me go back to my screen. So I wish I could change the scale of the calendar view because a lot of times I see this grid of calendar dates and then I don't realize even if I hit today that I actually have to scroll down and then I have this one section down here. So if there was some scaling option on this grid that's embedded, this calendar grid that's embedded inside Canvas, that would be super useful. Even if I shrink my browser, it's like I have to get this like microscopic ant size text and I still can't see the entire thing. So yeah, there's an Instructure feedback thing that you can take directly to the source. Okay, so exposure. Let's talk about exposure. And let me keep my YouTube window open so if there's questions, I can check on them. Okay, so again, you should be able to hit exposure and then have the link pop up here. So exposure is a very, very simple topic. It seems a little bit complex, and again, the way I feel like that we interface with it and describe it sometimes is counterintuitive. But because this time when I taught it, I chose to talk about depth of field, we've already talked about aperture. And again, we'll go over this f-stop idea that I keep promising that we'll talk about. But this really isn't a terribly complex topic. So I'm hoping that this will present it in a way that's simple enough for those of you that have never heard of any of this stuff. And then it's also in-depth enough for those of you that already know all of this that you won't be totally bored out of your minds. So exposure we talk about in terms of the exposure triangle, and that's mainly because there's three components that make up that exposure. So if you look at this exposure triangle, on this side you have the aperture, right? On this side you have the shutter speed, and on this side you have the ISO. So all three of those things in tandem work to determine the correct exposure, right? So if any one of these is off, then the picture could be too bright or too dark, right? So exposure, again, is just how much light is being exposed, or is that image sensor being exposed to. So if you have, so again, just to run really, really briefly over what each of these are, they have their own categories that we'll go back and talk about, but just for the sake of explaining the triangle, aperture is just the opening of the lens, right? The hole at the back of the lens that says let a lot of light in or let very little light in. The shutter speed is just how quickly is that that frame exposed to light, right? So if it's a very fast shutter, it's not going to have a lot of exposure, which means it's going to be darker. If it's a slow shutter, it's going to be brighter because your sensor is exposed for a longer period of time. And then ISO, right now, we'll just call it the sensitivity of the sensor. And that's a lot, again, like film stock, where if you shot film, or those of you that still do shoot film, you'll have an ASA or an ISO number. Those are just two different standards. But it's basically a way of saying in what environments can you use this film, right? One would a lot of times be a daylight ASA, meaning that film was not very sensitive, so you needed to go outside and shoot with the sunlight to be able to expose it. And then you might have one that's extremely sensitive, so it's meant for lower light conditions like inside a house, right? So those three things, like I say, it should be self-evident that if any one of those is off, the exposure is not going to be correct, right? So when we talk about all three of these things and put them on a triangle, if you imagine that each of these are weighted on each of these edges here, right, and it's sort of pivoting on some sort of little fulcrum or something, some pivot point right here in the middle of the triangle, then you're trying to keep this balanced on top, right, of this little pivot point without any one of these pulling too far to one side. So if you have a change, if you have a perfect exposure and then you have a change in aperture for a creative reason, right? We talked about depth of field. So that's a very, very common scenario, right? You might go to shoot a picture and you have something out of focus in the background and you're trying to focus on your subject and you want your depth of field, let's say, to be very, very shallow, so you just see the subject. So you guys should know that if you want a shallow depth of field, you shoot with a more open aperture, right, which is a smaller f number, which we're about to get into. So you guys already know that. But then if you say, okay, now the environment is suddenly very important to us, and now we want to see not only the subject, but their environment, and we'll have a little kind of real world example of this later on in the lesson. But then suddenly creatively you need to change your aperture because you want to deepen your depth of field, right? You want to see more stuff. So because of that, you change your aperture, right? And then your shutter and your ISO have to compensate for that change in aperture somehow, right? So if you took away a bunch of light by closing your aperture down, then you have to suddenly add light by dragging or increasing your shutter speed, right? Or by increasing the sensitivity of that sensor, the ISO, or do both, right? That's always an option to do increase, like compensate for that change in aperture, half with an increase or decrease in this case of shutter speed, right? And half with an increase of ISO. And it could be any combination of these two. The point is that your shutter speed and your ISO are going to have to, in tandem or one or the other, compensate for the change you made in aperture. Okay, so again, that's not terribly confusing. Hopefully that made sense to most of you. Do shout out in the comments if that is confusing in any way, but we'll talk through it, and then I think as we go through it, if any of that wasn't clear, it should make more sense. So the reason that we go over exposure so much is because it's both a technical and a creative tool, right? So exposure has sort of a technical right and wrong, in that if you have a picture so dark that you can't see the subject, you can say that's a technically incorrect exposure, right? You can ruin a shot completely because you just can't see the thing, or because you've exposed it to so much light that the sensor is saturated, and then we call it blown out, right? The highlights are clipped, meaning that sensor's got so much light that it's not registering those values correctly, and it's all just a sea of white. So usually your exposure is not going to be so bad that the entire frame is just white, right? But it's going to be potentially, you'll have these areas in the frame that have content that you want the audience to be able to see, but that content loses detail because it clips to white, and then you have no information there. So if you guys remember, like this happened more back in the day, but you'd see a lot of pictures where suddenly your entire sky was just white, right? You'd see detail in the land, but not in the sky. So like, or vice versa, you'd see the clouds and all the detail in the sky, but then the land would go totally black. So when we talk about dynamic range, which I keep bringing up, right, again, that ability to capture shadow detail and bright highlight detail, that's what we're talking about, is that ability to get that entire range. So if you have a limited dynamic range, right, which every camera has some sort of limit to its dynamic range, then you're going to have to be careful with where you put that exposure, because something is going to be clipping white, right, and something's going to be clipping black. You're going to be losing information on either end of that spectrum, so your exposure is defining exactly where you put that window of available dynamic range. So, yeah, so let's just dive into this lesson content. So if we look at the aperture and f-stops, this I think, again, is one of those things that feels a little bit confusing. So I put this bold up at the top to encourage you guys, if this feels new and overwhelming to you, just remember this. This is like all you really need to know out of this entire page, right? So how open is your lens? That's what the aperture is saying, right? How big is this hole in your lens that's letting light through? So if you look at this picture here, you can see this is in fact, let me zoom this up a little bit. So you can see right here, there's that entrance, right? That aperture as seen through the front of the lens, the entrance pupil. So this is what we talk about when we refer to aperture, right? How big is this hole right here? And these little leaves of this aperture will open and close to change the size of that hole. And just incidentally, you'll also see some really cool things about this opening and how it affects other things aesthetically in the picture, which we might get to in this class at some point. Okay, so that's the aperture. How open is your lens, right? And then this is the big thing that's confusing. A small f-stop, right, a small f number equals a big depth of field, right? So just remember that the smaller these f numbers that we're about to talk about, the bigger your depth of field, the more stuff is in focus. And then vice versa, right? So if you do a larger f-stop number, right, so like a 1.4, then the more shallow your depth of field. So if that feels like all your brain wants to take for today, just tune out the rest. But I'm going to explain why, because I think, again, especially where it's a college level class, it's important to know how we derive that F number because it helps you understand other things about how a camera works. So let's talk a little bit about this f-stop scale. So this is basically what I just said, right? This is confusing because the aperture is described in terms of something called an f-stop, and the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture's opening is, right? So 1.4 is a big hole and f16 a small one. So if you look at this, let's just jump down to this right here, right? So f-stop equals the focal length of the lens, right? So we've talked about focal length. If you remember, we watched that little video on focal length, and we described the focal length as basically, let me grab a lens actually. So the easiest way to remember what focal length is just to remember the point at which that lens starts converging light to a point, right? Because that's what the lens is doing. It's taking a bunch of light, your whole image, from out here, and then it's pulling it all down, right, to one place where it can all be in focus on a single plane type of thing. So the point at which the distance between where those rays start to converge and where they stop, where that happens inside the lens is essentially your focal length, right? So that focal length, when you have a focal length, right, like on a lens like this, like a 15 millimeter focal length, if you divide that by the aperture diameter, that's how you get this F number. So let me jump back to this. So this little formula here, like I say, it's not imperative that you memorize it. Even on the quizzes, which again are all open book, right? So you can use this information when you take the quiz. I don't think I even ask you about this, maybe. But like I say, it's important to know how you get this information. So the aperture diameter is measured in millimeters, right? So this little hole right here, if you were to measure that in millimeters, and then have that be the denominator of this fraction, right? The number on the bottom, that's how we get this number. So obviously, if you know simple math, right, the bigger the number you're dividing by, the smaller your result is going to be, right? So if you have a focal length of, let's say, a 50 millimeter lens, and then your aperture is, let's say, 10 millimeters or something, right? Then if you take your focal length of 50 divided by your aperture size of 10 millimeters, right, then you get an f5, right? But then if you were to increase this, right, to say 20 millimeters or something, or 25 would probably make it a little easier, then that should make sense why this f-stop number gets smaller, right? Because this number is increasing, meaning this divided by this gets smaller. So, like I say, it's pretty simple, I think. It's fairly intuitive once you know the reason behind it, but if you don't want to remember that formula, don't worry about it. Just remember small f number, big aperture, shallow depth of field. So let's talk about the actual f-stop scale of how this is measured. So if you look down here with this little graphic, which again, maybe I can blow up a little bit, you'll see this is, these are similar to the numbers that you'll see on the top of your camera as you adjust your aperture. So most of your cameras will have, well, I shouldn't say most, about half of your cameras probably will have a dedicated wheel for aperture where you'll actually be able to physically change one control on the camera, and that will open and close this lens entrance, right, this aperture. So the numbers you'll see on there won't necessarily follow this scale exactly because you'll have settings inside your menu on your camera to change the exposure in terms of either half stops or third stops usually. Most camera manufacturers give you that option. Some photographers like to be able to have more control and just a finer grained sort of detail setting, right? To be able to say, let me jump up a third of a stop from f2, right? And then another third and then hit 2.8. So again, it doesn't necessarily matter on your camera how many steps you have between each of these. The point of this scale is that between each of these numbers, we have a doubling or a halving of the light. So that's very important to remember, right? When we think about light, sometimes there's a temptation to think about it in a linear way. And when I say linear, I mean we think, and the numbers won't make sense, but just for the sake of explanation, we think, okay, if I have one photon, then I get one brightness value, right? If I have two photons, I've doubled my light hitting the sensor. So now I have a brightness value of 2, right? 3 photons looks like 3 brightness levels, right? So that would be a linear relationship, right? As we increase one of the available amount of light units, our perception of that light's brightness goes up by 1 as well. So that's a common sort of form to use when you're doing like visual effects and stuff online, and like post-production and video editing and stuff. But as far as our perception of light goes, totally forget about that linear scale, right? We don't see light in a linear way. So there's several things in photography that you'll just get used to thinking more logarithmically than linearly, right? So again, like I say, I don't want this to feel overwhelming. Like as soon as we start talking about denominators of fractions and like logarithmic scales and things, I feel like it sounds more complex than it is. But just know this. Each one of these, again, like I said, is a doubling or a halving of the light. So to go from 1 to 1.4, right, that's going to be a doubling or a halving of the light because we're making it smaller, right? 1.4 to 2 is going to halve it again. So basically the distance between this and this is going to be half the light, but then this first f-stop to this f-stop is going to be a quarter, right? Because remember, this at f2 is half of what it was at 1.4, and 1.4 was half of 1, right? So again, it's not a linear, it's a logarithmic relationship. And a big reason I like to bring that up is because I think it gives people context for why lenses are more expensive when you get the faster lenses, right? So we talked about in class, most of the kit lenses you'll buy will start somewhere in this range, right? About 3.5. So if you have a 3.5, if it says f3.5 on the front of your lens, then it'll a lot of times have a range if it's a zoom lens, and it'll say like 3.5 to 5.6, right? So that's meaning that, again, at the wide end of your zoom, this is about how large your diameter is for your aperture entrance. At the tight end of your lens, this is about how wide that diameter is, right? So again, because as you zoom in, you lose light, this f-stop number decreases. So you'd say, so for the sake of argument, let's just say you have a lens that is a kit lens, but it starts at 2.8, right? So you might have a $200 kit lens that starts at 2.8, and then you'll see, Better Touch Tool wants to update. And then you'll see that a lens that costs, let's even just go up to f2, right? 1 stop greater. Suddenly that lens goes up to like $900. So again, when you look at it, you go 2.8 to 2, that's hardly a difference, right? Why does that lens cost so much more? Again, think about it in terms of having twice the amount of light available, and suddenly it makes sense, right? So if you're an event photographer and you are shooting at dusk, right, and you're shooting some sort of wedding reception outside and there's dim light, having twice the amount of light makes a huge difference suddenly, right? Or if you're a sports photographer of some sort and you're shooting in some sort of venue where you need to capture the action and freeze the action completely, that means your shutter speed is going to have to be very, very short, right? Because you need to freeze the athletes in time, but you're only going to be able to do a short shutter speed if you have a large aperture, meaning you're letting a lot of light enter the camera. So suddenly, again, having twice the amount of light available makes a big difference. So that's why a lot of times when you get into these faster apertures, you start paying a premium, because the manufacturers, both, it costs them more, like it's a more difficult process to produce the thing, but they also know that you're a professional shooting in an environment that demands more than just a common kit lens would. So when we talk about these things, hopefully you're realizing now that as you go to shoot stuff creatively, you have, again, both creative and technical constraints, right? You have the creative thing that you want to accomplish. So let's go back to the example of an athlete. Let's say you're shooting a rugby game, right? So you're shooting rugby and you try to take a picture of the player, right? And let's say you wanted the context of the player with the players around him or her. If you creatively, you might want to stop your aperture down and deepen your depth of field. But again, you need to freeze the action, and freezing the action and having crisp edges might be more important for your purposes than seeing the amount you want to see, right? So then that means you're going to have to open up your aperture anyway, just to be able to get enough light in to freeze the action. So it kind of, I hope, underscores the point of why we talk about all this stuff, right? This is why when I refer to that exposure triangle, it's important to realize that these three things are interrelated, right? Because in the example I just gave, you'll want to make sure your ISO is up as high as possible so the sensor is as sensitive as possible without being too noisy, so that you can capture the creative part of what you want, right? Which might be a deeper depth of field, but also hit that technical requirement of freezing the action with a shorter shutter speed. So, like I say, as we talk about these things, realize that depending on the type of photography you do, one thing will be much, much more important than another, right? You can never criticize somebody for buying a 1.4 lens, right? I see people all the time that'll go, oh, that's ridiculous, right? Why would somebody even buy this, like spend $1,500 or $2,000 to buy this f1.4 lens? For the type of work they do. Maybe they do astrophotography, right? And maybe their exposure is a minute-long exposure. In the course of a minute, you'll see the actual rotation of the Earth. You'll see the stars make these star trails, right? Instead of being points of light, you'll actually see them start to curve. So if you can go from a minute exposure down to 30 seconds exposure, right? Then that's a significant difference, right? 30 seconds less for your exposure. Or if you're doing a time lapse, right, and you're taking a bunch of exposures and stitching them all together, or playing them back, right, then suddenly if you could get twice the amount of frames, right, because you're shooting a frame every 30 seconds instead of having to wait a minute between frames, that opens a lot of options to you, right? So that's just the difference between one stop. And again, a lot of times you'll see a difference of like 3.5 on a kit lens or a kind of a consumer lens down to like 1.4 on a really professional or more high-end lens. So you won't always see lenses that fall in these even stop numbers, right? Like there are a lot of lenses you'll see that'll be a 1.8 lens. That 1.8 isn't an official f-stop number, but it is still valid, right? They're just advertising the lens at the true stop that it can hit. So just be aware of that, and it makes it slightly harder to figure out exactly where your f-stop number lies. But like if you're trying to calculate an exposure change, it's a little bit harder because, like I say, it's not a linear scale, so you kind of just have to guess exactly how it relates. But you can kind of round it up to f2 and then make your calculations easier, and it's really not too bad. So let me check for comments. Looks like we're good. So if anybody has any questions about that f-stop idea, or how focal length and aperture diameter are related, or how it applies practically, let me know. We're going to move on. A lot of this I kind of already talked about, so we'll be pretty quick about it, but let's jump into shutter and talk about that a little bit. So like I said, just like shutters on a window, your camera has a shutter which opens and closes to allow a certain amount of light to hit the sensor, right? Your shutter is controlled by a time value and is simply the amount of time the sensor is open to that light. So like I said, the house analogy I feel like is easy, because you can imagine if you go and open the shutters on your house, more light's going to come in the longer you leave those open, right? And then as soon as you close them and stop the light from coming in, no light's going to come in, right? So I've used this term several times. Here it is in print. So the shutter can be dragged, right? Or left open for a long time for some really cool time-based effects. So you've seen like car lights streaking, right? Like nighttime photography where you'll see a bunch of these light streaks of the car's headlights and taillights as they move by. Star trails, so that's what I just referenced, right? That you can actually kind of see the rotation of the Earth through the star trails in the sky, which again might be something you want and might be something you don't want. And when I talked about that uncanny valley before, since we're already kind of talking about this astrophotography thing, that's one of those areas where you need to commit to what you're doing artistically or just not try and do it at all, right? So I referenced the uncanny valley as a term that computer graphics artists will use when I talked about the girl with the big eyes in that Alita movie, right? Like I think they gave her big eyes so that she looks intentionally comical, or not comical in a funny way, but she's not trying to be photoreal human, because we can't make photoreal humans, and when we try so hard but we're not quite there, it looks worse than if we hadn't tried at all, right? So again, the star trails thing, if you have perfect points of light, it looks awesome. If you have these really cool streaking arcs of light, that looks awesome too. If you have something in between where you kind of have these little curves of like arcs of light in the sky, it looks like you didn't know what you were doing and you accidentally took a shot with too long of an exposure and kind of got this unhappy medium, right? So let me show you really quickly what I'm talking about, just in case anybody hasn't seen images like this. So these are examples of really, really long shutter speeds and star trail photography, right? So in fact, this one I think is Utah. Anybody ever been down here? So anyway, so yeah, like I say, I like to show you examples of these things so you can see. You may have seen a picture like this before and been like, oh, that's a cool thing, but not known how it's achieved. If you notice not only the stars in this picture, but also look at the water, right? Water's obviously moving over the course of how long it takes to get a picture like this. So you'll have a lot of cool kind of smeary looking water effects here, in addition to this cool dragged shutter for the stars above. Okay, so yeah, and then I talked about action sports, right? So motion blur is kind of this concept of it's basically if your shutter's open for a fairly long time, you'll see the motion of the subject in the frame, right? That's what that blur is when you have a shutter speed that's a slower shutter speed. So we don't talk a ton about video in this class, but in video you'll always have a shutter speed that relates really specifically, not always, but often relates specifically to your frame rate. Because our eyes are used to seeing a certain amount of blur, like we don't see the world in totally sharp, consecutive frames. We see sort of this smoother version of things as they kind of, blend, motion blends kind of between frames, even though we don't necessarily see in frames. So anyway, that's more video related, so we won't get into that. But just remember, shutter speed either freezes motion in time, right, or allows us to see time in one frame, right? So that star trail exposure is showing us the change of our subject over time. So it's kind of a cool thing. There's a lot you can do with that creatively, and hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But shutter for now, you don't need to remember anything really beyond that. So let's look at ISO. And let me check my messages really quickly one more time, make sure that everybody's good. Okay, we're good. So ISO, like I said, for now we're just going to call it the sensitivity of this sensor. I think probably, hopefully in your more advanced photography class, if you guys go on to take the next section of this, they'll sort of rectify that slightly incorrect information. But for now, the easiest way to teach this, again, is just the higher that number goes, the more sensitive the sensor is. So you can see on this picture of this Canon, ISO 200 is a fairly low ISO, right? Usually these will start at 1 or 200, and then they'll go up to, depends on the camera, but they can go up extremely high. So again, the consequence of the practical thing you need to know is that the consequence of shooting at higher ISOs is that you get more noise or more grain in your picture, right? So you'll see people online that'll say, oh, this camera is usable up to this ISO. My advice to everybody is always don't go online and read somebody's opinion on how high of an ISO you can shoot, because it really doesn't do any good. Like it's not like you hit a certain ISO number and it suddenly becomes so grainy that it's just objectively unusable suddenly, right? Everybody's tolerance for grain is going to be very different. People will, do things that they print on the side of buildings versus things that they just share on a, 5-inch phone screen. So know exactly what you're shooting for, how the person that is intended to see that picture is going to see it, and just what your own personal tolerance threshold for noise is. So if you get a new camera, and even with new lenses that have faster apertures and things, I always recommend just play around with the camera enough to get a sense for how noisy it looks at what ISO. And you can also do this if you've taken a bunch of pictures. Go back and look at the metadata of those pictures. You can see what the setting for ISO was, and that'll help you kind of also make a determination of, okay, this looked too grainy, right? I never want to go that high on my ISO again. But again, don't listen to other people that are like, you can't go beyond ISO 1600 or you can't go beyond ISO 3200. Again, it doesn't make sense because you don't know how picky they are about grain. And if you're in a situation where you really can't see anything because it's so dark and you need to bump up to 3200 to let, again, twice the amount of light in effectively, then at least you'll get a picture, right? You'll get something usable. So if it's the difference between having something really noisy but visible and having a subject that's just totally black because you were so fixated that somebody on a forum told you don't go up this high with your ISO, pick having a semi-usable picture over a completely wasted picture, right? So that's kind of a soapbox speech, I know. But again, test out your own camera, turn the ISO up, and then just pay attention to how that noise and grain increase in the image. So when we look at more in depth at Photoshop, we'll see in Camera Raw there's some noise busting settings, right? So a lot of that noise can actually be cleaned up fairly well. So I shoot on higher ISOs without worrying about it too much. Because again, just experience has taught me to not worry so much about sticking to what people online say. But I'd encourage you to do the whole workflow, both take pictures, see how the ISO relates, and then also put them on the computer and then watch what happens to them as you work with them on the computer and just see how much of that noise you can pull out and still have a salvageable picture. So the one thing I will mention with ISO, and again, we won't dive too deep into it in this class, but it's that your dynamic range is affected as you increase your ISO, generally speaking. So there are certain ISOs at which you'll capture more detail and highlights and shadows than you will other ISOs. And that's why you'll hear people talk about the native ISO of the camera. For a beginning photography class, we're not going to go into it any more than that. I just give you that heads up to know if you start researching it, you will run into that. But for the most part, don't even worry about that. The practical difference isn't so great that it's going to massively affect you, especially now that the dynamic range on cameras is so much higher than it used to be. Okay, so let's mark this complete. So hopefully that kind of sort of lays this foundation for what these principles of exposure are, right? And then I want to talk about it in terms of real life application, because that's the whole point of all this, right? Isn't just to talk about it in lectures, but to actually go out and apply it somehow. So if anybody has any questions, let's see, grainy ISO photo. Yeah, we can definitely do that. So here are a couple examples, actually. So when you look at a lot of these pictures, you'll notice it's not just sort of an aesthetic kind of, how can I explain this? It's not just like a grain. Noise isn't just a uniform grain that sort of appears to get stronger and stronger and stronger as you increase your ISO. You also start to get just bizarre kind of artifacts and banding and other strange things happening. So if you look at this picture, you can notice everything that should be black is pretty much red, right? So that's one problem. You get a lot of infrared contamination, which is basically light that's just below the visible human spectrum, but that a camera can actually see. So you get pollution and contamination that way. And again, you get these kind of bizarre artifacts. So if you look at this one too, you can see examples of graininess in high ISO images. And that being said, even a normally exposed image, if you push the exposure up quite a bit on the computer, you'll get similar looking results. So yeah, it's not that it's like I said, it's not that it's a terrible and inexcusable thing. Here's a good example because it compares both of them together. So ISO 100 on the left, right, and then ISO 3200 on the right. So the thing that I keep hinting at getting into but not actually getting into, because again I don't want it to be overwhelming in this class, is that ISO isn't really the sensitivity of your sensor. Your sensor sensitivity doesn't change. It's again, like I mentioned, I think one of the first days or so, all your camera's sensor is basically a photodiode connected to a capacitor, right? So as soon as that photodiode has this, as soon as it's hit with these photons optically, it's going to register. It's going to drain that capacitor to some extent, and it's the amount that it drained that capacitor that registers as a voltage, and then that voltage gets quantified as something so that it can become a digital value versus an analog one, right? So that's really all your sensor is doing, is converting all of this analog light into this digital signal, this ones and zeros signal that we can pull up on a computer and edit and see. So a lot of what your ISO is doing is basically just saying, how are we going to quantify this analog signal and how are we going to store it as a digital value? That's why your sensor will have kind of one dynamic range that it's actually sort of capable of, and why only one ISO setting really captures that whole dynamic range. So the reason I go back into that is because as we look at these pictures, like I say, you can take a normally exposed image and increase the exposure on the computer, and you'll see a lot of times very similar image to what you'd see if you just increased the ISO in camera, right? Because it's similar, not identical, but it's kind of a similar digital gain in that way, that it's not actually, again, increasing sensitivity in a way that's capturing more information. It's just kind of changing how that information is stored. So yeah, so hopefully that answers your question about looking at a picture with a high ISO, so you can kind of see some of the noise and what it looks like. And different pictures will clean up better or worse than others too. So it's kind of one of those things that I can't totally just show you. You'll just shoot and you'll be able to realize as you take certain shots and go to edit them, how high your ISO can be before it's uncomfortably affecting your image. Alrighty, so let's look at this really quick. Like I say, this is simple to understand. I feel like that whole exposure triangle thing shouldn't be too overwhelming, but in application, sometimes it can be a little bit confusing when you step away from the classroom and then go to actually do all this. Okay, so I'll just read through this. So let's say you're shooting a portrait of a solitary hipster in front of a lake. You're shooting at f11 because you want the hipster to be the main subject, but you need, imagine there's a D there, the lake visible as well for context, right? So this is like that example I mentioned at the very beginning, right? We're trying to see both the hipster and the lake. We want to see the environment. So you zoom in now and you want a nice portrait of just the hipster, right? So now we don't care about the environment. Let's say it's his classy sweater here that's the subject of our attention now, right? We want to see more, we want to focus more on him, and we don't want the distractions of these ducks and this rippling lake and this moody atmosphere. Like, we want him to be the clear subject, so we want to shallow depth of field. So we go from f11 to f2.8, right? So let's say that's the widest open aperture setting your lens has. Now, if you're shooting manual, meaning you're determining exposure manually, then the camera will do nothing for you, right? The camera is going to expect you to maintain the exposure after you've made the aperture change. And if you do nothing, you'll end up with a blazingly bright exposure, right? So remembering that aperture follows that f-stop scale that we just looked at the bottom of this aperture section, then you know if you go from f11 to f2.8, you've increased the light hitting the sensor by 4 stops, right? So come back to this scale and you can look at that. So 11, right, 11 to 8, 8 to 5.6, 5.6 to 4, and then 4 to 2.8, right? So 4 stops, again, each of those being a doubling of the light is a big deal, right? So that means 2 to the 4th power, or 16 times, right, the amount of light is now hitting your sensor. So you need to reduce your exposure by those same 4 stops, right, using ISO or shutter or some combination of both, right? So now let's look at that practically. So your ISO is set to 1600, let's say. So you twirl the dial from 1600 to 800. So ISO, again, it works completely linear, so that one is easy. So having it to go from 1600 to 800, that's reducing it by 1 stop, right? So going from 1600 to 800 gave you 1 stop. Now we need to compensate still 3 more stops, right? So we'll go from 800 to 400, right? There's 2 stops. 400 to 200, right, is 3 stops, and 200 to 100, 4 stops, right? You didn't have to touch the shutter speed. By compensating for the aperture change using only the ISO, you've maintained the same exposure. So this example works well because we started at ISO 1600. But let's say you were at ISO 800 and your camera can't go lower than ISO 100. So now you'll need to double your shutter speed to compensate for that extra stop of brightness, right? Because if we started at 800 instead of 1600, then we'll be starting, we won't be able to go lower than 100. We can't go to 50, right? Some cameras you can actually, but let's say the lowest we can go ISO-wise is 100. So now, again, we need to take that extra stop out of our shutter speed. So doubling our shutter speed to compensate for that extra stop of brightness. Let's just say we were at 1/160th, right? And then we need to, again, make it darker. So we're going to make this shutter speed faster, meaning we're going to double this number, right? 1/320th of a second. And then that should be the same exposure. So again, this is where the creativity in photography is, I think, a lot of fun, because it's a balance between creative and technical, right? You have to maintain this exposure the same, but at the same time you're thinking, okay, but if I change ISO, it's going to get more noisy, right? If I change shutter, it's going to affect motion blur. If I change aperture, it's going to affect depth of field. So how can I make the best possible choice for this photo using these elements, right? To technically have a well-exposed photo, but artistically show what I want to show. So I don't think we'll get into the zone system a lot. My personal opinion is that the zone system is kind of an antiquated way of thinking about things. Some people would crucify me for saying that. But yeah, it's basically a technique that was espoused by Ansel Adams, and so everybody kind of looks at it as gospel doctrine, I guess. It's just it made a lot of sense at the time because of the way exposure was calculated, and because we didn't have these digital cameras with a lot of intelligence and metering capability inside them. So I'm not going to go into it right now, but if you want to, you can go back and read about how the zone system works, and it's definitely worth kind of knowing or being familiar with, or at least knowing what it is in case anybody ever asks you about it. But like I say, in today's modern photography, I don't really think it's the best way to set your exposure. And then I kind of go into that in here, right? So again, I don't think I really want to get into that right now. It's not as important. Okay, so here's a question then in general. So now you know kind of how all these things work relative to each other, right? You know you have your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed, those being the 3 parts of that exposure triangle, and that they all relate. But that doesn't really help you take a good picture in and of itself, right? So if you were to walk outside right now to go take a picture of the mountains, what do you set any of those to, right? You know how they interact relative to each other, but you have no absolute information about how bright the scene is outside right now. So the real answer to this is basically that you'll use your camera to determine the brightness more often than not. But if you wanted to avoid the camera completely and not use its own internal meter, right? That's what we call the camera's little tool that it has to gauge the brightness of the scene. It's light meter. And there's meters that exist outside the camera and inside, and we may get into that a little bit later. But point being, if you're trying to determine an exposure outside, there's something called the Sunny 16 rule, and it basically gives you a starting point so you can calculate your values that you want to use from that point. And it can be really useful for like an old film camera or something with limited metering capabilities. So what it basically says is that if you're outside on a sunny day, if your aperture is set to f16, right, which is a fairly small opening, then your shutter speed and your ISO are going to be reciprocal, right? So if you have an ISO of 100, then your shutter speed is going to be 1/100. So if you look at the explanation here, it's basically what I just said, right? So shooting at f16 and ISO 200, a shutter speed of 1/200 should give you a decent exposure. So again, that's a way to go outside and in just without any information, be able to just know this is sort of about how bright this scene should be, so I can start making my exposure decisions based on that. But when you go outside, most shots that you go to shoot aren't going to be, you're not going to want f16, right? It's fairly useful. but you might want a shallow depth of field, right? In that case, you might want f1.8 or something. So in that case, you need to do exactly what we just talked about doing, right? Say, okay, how many stops are there between f16 and the aperture setting that I want to shoot at, right? And then count on that f-stop scale back, and then say, okay, now I need to change ISO, right? I need to change shutter speed or both to compensate for the change I made in aperture. So I want to show you one thing really quickly on this scale. If you're out in the middle of nowhere and you don't have access to the internet and you can't Google this f-stop scale, it's much better to just have this memorized. And if you are pursuing photography seriously at all, just definitely memorize the f-stop scale. I don't make it an assignment for beginning photography, but it really probably should be one. And it's not as hard to memorize as it looks. So the big thing you have to remember is the first two stops, right? 1 and 1.4. And then if you'll notice this scale, if I go from 1 to 2, right, skipping 1, to 4, to 8, to 16, what's happening? They're doubling, right? So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. 1.4 doubled would be 2.8. Doubled would be 5.6, right? 11-ish, and then 22. So that's the easy way to remember the f-stop scale. Just memorize the first two stops and then know that you just skip a stop and double the number, right? So like I say, when you first start doing photography, this is a lot harder because you're just not used to thinking in terms of this. And if you're trying to shoot anything that's moving quickly, like I wouldn't recommend going to shoot a picture of, you know, like your 2-year-old or something and being like, okay, I want to change my aperture. So let me think. I've gone down 6 stops and right? Or if you're shooting a wild animal or something, like both of those subjects will be long gone before you figured out the amount of stops between f11 and f1.8. But we'll talk about some tools that let the camera do this for you later on. But again, it's good to introduce it from a manual exposure perspective so that you know what's going on. And memorizing it and working with it frequently, it'll become much more kind of habit, much more habitual the more you work with it. All right. So I think that's probably enough for the exposure conversation. I want to show you one tool and then we'll get into the critique. And then I wanted to do some more Photoshop stuff, but I'm not sure if we'll have time today. So let's do this. Let's look at, actually, if it's already 5. So let's take our break now. When we come back from the break, I'll show you this kind of cool tool that I think is one of the more useful ways to play around with exposure, because you can do it without even taking pictures. And then I think let's just do a little 5-minute break. I'll pick back up at 5:05, and then we'll talk about this tool and then do our critique. And then if we have time, then we can get into some of that other stuff. But if not, if I don't get into it, I was going to assign it to you, but I won't do that. Let's just take our 5-minute break and we'll try and get through all this stuff in the next 20 minutes. See you soon. Alrighty. Everybody should be back by now, hopefully. Okay, so really quick, let's look back at the course, and I want to show you that tool. I'll probably go over it probably tomorrow in class, I think. I'll just show you what it is really quickly, and then I'll kind of do a little refresher tomorrow. So if we come over to the site, the kind of segue between the exposure and the camera operation has this simulator tool. So this is a tool by Canon, but it's really, really useful, I've found, in explaining this whole concept of exposure, because it basically gives you a little virtual camera. And then if this, again, is brand new to you, it gives you these little tips on how you can use this virtual camera to kind of influence your exposure. So it's really quite simple, right? It gives you an aperture control, shutter speed, and ISO. And then you can basically come in and say, okay, let's change what we have here from being f8, right? Let's change it to f22. So we're closing down our aperture. And then let's take a picture and see what that looks like. And then it'll say, okay, you're very underexposed, right? Because you took your aperture down, right? And didn't compensate for it at all. And then you have a wide depth of field because of your aperture setting. And you have invisible motion, right? Because your shutter speed was fast enough that you... So in fact, this is one thing that I like, because it'll actually show you shutter speed. So if I come from a 60th of a second now, if I crank this way up and then I bring this back down, right, to try and get a little bit more light in this scene. So let's say we take this to all the way to 2.8. So it'll be slightly underexposed, but not too bad, right? So now you can see, if you look at this propeller on this biplane, that's very sharp, right, versus the first one that we took, where it's very, very blurred. Right, so this is an example of that motion blur that comes from a slower shutter speed, and then this from a faster shutter speed, right? It's freezing the motion. So again, I like it because you can see the effects of shutter speed. You can see the same thing with aperture, right? Where again, these pencil things are in focus up here. And then as soon as we take that aperture to a faster aperture or a more wide open aperture, they become blurred. That term is really confusing when we talk about aperture that way. And I wish that the powers that be had never sort of decided upon faster as a descriptor for aperture, because it is confusing, because faster sounds like something a shutter would do, right? Open and close very quickly. So when I say a faster lens or a faster aperture, that means more wide open, right? So it basically means the ability to take a picture with a faster shutter speed, but you'll hear that used all over the place. So just get used to both me and any photographer that you talk to talking about terms, talking about lenses in terms of being fast, right? So an f1.8 lens is faster than an f3.5 lens or an f4 lens or something. Okay, so like I say, this little tool is cool, and we'll go back into it a little bit more later, but if you want to play around with that just to kind of see aesthetically some of the things we're talking about, that's in this little simulator link under camera operation, and like I say, it's a pretty useful tool to sort of get some of these things figured out. So that's all we'll say about that. And if anybody has any questions on any of that stuff, again, let me know in the chat, and I'll try and go over it a little bit more. But for now, let's look at some of these pictures inside Photoshop. So there was some really awesome stuff submitted. Thank you guys. And I'm very thrilled that some of you want to go over the critique. It will be a little bit bizarre because the class is critiquing through chat. So I'll start talking about it, and then please, everybody that is still participating on chat right now, shout out and let us know what your sort of thoughts are on this. Again, it's a critique, so it can be positive things, it can be negative things, it can be totally ambivalent things. Whatever your response is, right? You can say, I feel panda bears when I look at this shot, right? Like, it's photography. You can say whatever you want to. So just comments about what this image evokes, right? It makes you think of, are totally valid, because I think as a photographer, sometimes I'm really interested to hear what people actually feel when they see a shot, not necessarily just the artistic critique. But also include things as we talk about these techniques, right? Like, you like the use of shallow depth of field on this, or you don't like it, or you think, hey, this could have been more interesting if they tried this, or whatever. So yeah, please do shout those out in the comments for the sake of your peers, and I will try and kind of call out some of them as I see them coming through too. I think what I'll do, so all of these that we're going to look at, we have permission from the people to show, but I think what I'll do is hide the file names so that you guys can actually see whose they are. And then if you do want to claim the picture, maybe I'll let you just claim it in the comments. I don't know. I know some people are more sensitive than others about having their work displayed. So I'll just go ahead and hide the names of whose this picture is for now. And then, I don't know, maybe I should say if you've agreed or solicited the critique and don't want your name disclosed, then let me know that way. But for now, we'll just go over these anonymously. Okay. So this first one, again, shout out in the comments if you have anything you want to say about it. But I think this is a fun composition. Like this shows somebody trying to do something that wasn't the easiest thing to do, right? Like the camera's put in a place that's not the most comfortable to get to, right? It's not the 5.5 foot tall point of view that we see walking through life, right? So it looks like just a grassy field. I mean, some of this has gone to seed here, so it's either somebody hasn't cut their lawn in a long time, right? Or it's some sort of field that has some other kind of wild grass stuff growing. So I can't really tell exactly what this is, and that doesn't really matter, right? You can see the sky and then the mountains with the light on them in the background. So when I talk about dynamic range and clipping, this is one of those interesting things that you'll find. So if you look back here, you can see, in fact, I could even do this and we could get a color value for this area. So let me come over to this and then let's grab this. Okay, I'm gonna go full screen. So if you look at this area right here, you'll see that this is losing color information, right? So you can see how it's kind of got this red blooming and then it goes into yellow. So this is what clipping looks like, but it's color channel specific clipping. So if I come into the red channel, this is the amount of red that camera sensor captured. This is the blue that it captured, and this is the green that it captured. So as soon as you see this, what this looks like exactly right here, this you'll get to recognize this sort of pattern, and this is red channel clipping. It doesn't look too bad in this shot. Like I wouldn't even bring it up as a critiquing point if it weren't for the fact that we're talking about exposure right now, but it's a perfect example to talk about exposure because it shows you what clipping looks like. So I mentioned before, when you have clipping in whites, it doesn't just look like the whole frame is overexposed necessarily. It just means whatever's outside of the dynamic range that camera could capture is clipping. So in this case, the red information was so strong that it saturated the sensor, right? And it went from having information like it does with the gray values here to having no information, which is what this white blob is, right? Is just a completely clipped area. So there are some options to deal with this. If this was shot raw, then because you still have data in your green and blue channels, again, this is the blue channel, this is the green channel, and this is the red one, then you could restore information in the red channel based on what's happening in the green and blue channels. So when you see sliders that talk about things like highlight recovery, that's what they're doing usually, is taking information from the channels that are not clipped, these two, and using it to fill in this blob of area that is clipped here. But like I say, you'll see this in faces a lot. People will overexpose and the face will actually start to have this weird posterization or kind of this gradient to it where you can see it kind of goes from yellow to this banding of orangish and then out from there. So yeah, it's something that you can look at now and you can say that's the red channel clipping and impress your friends. So from an exposure standpoint, this actually, when I talk about the focal point, right, when we talk about what are we actually taking a picture of, this draws my attention quite quickly because there's a fair amount of contrast there. You have the contrast of these cooler colors, right? Like all of this stuff kind of around here is bluish and greenish, right? And then you have this sort of complementary, really warm tone right here in the middle. So that draws my eye right to this point, first of all. And I'm not sure if that was the photographer's intent or not, to have this be the focal point. This over here is what's actually in focus, right? This stem of grass right here, blade of grass, whatever the agriculturally correct term for grass is. So this is maybe a more obvious focal point, but there's not enough to differentiate this entire thing from the background for my eye to really latch onto this. So I think as far as the critique, like the biggest critique I would make of this picture is I'm just not sure exactly where my eyes should go or what I should be looking at. So this would make an awesome phone wallpaper. You know how like you have your lock screen and it's got like the date and time and all that stuff on top of it? In my mind, this makes a nice backdrop for something like a desktop or a, again, a phone thing that says it's 5:16 and then has your little thing here and all your notifications of all your cool friends. So those types of pictures a lot of times benefit from not having a strong focal point because it's the information that's overlaid on top of it that's the focal point. But again, there's not one place that I go to immediately. If anything, this is probably where I start, but that's kind of so abstract that I don't really know where to go from there. So I think the things this picture did awesome are getting a unique perspective and point of view, right? And if you wanted to Photoshop like a little snail or something crawling up this blade of grass, that could be a really cool way to have, your eye directed to something and have a subject. But if it's just a standalone shot completely on its own, I'm not exactly sure where I'm looking first. But as far as applying the parameters of the assignment and getting an interesting composition and point of view, well done on this. Okay, so Mason says really beautiful work here. I do think, however, I would have liked to see just a touch more color of the sky and mountain behind the in-focus blades of grass, but that's just me being nitpicky. Yeah, so I could see that. It kind of depends. That one's pretty subjective, right? Wanting to see more mountain and sky. So if you guys like Mason do agree that this would benefit from more mountain and sky in the background, this is one of those examples where a telephoto lens could come in handy because the telephoto lens is going to make all this background stuff like the mountain much bigger relative to this foreground stuff like the grass. So if you wanted to see the mountain bigger in the frame, that would be an option. But to be able to see everything in the frame too, you're going to start to have even more shallow depth of field, and then the mountain at some point is not even going to be recognizable as a mountain. It'll just be a really abstract blob in the distance. So to see more mountain and sky, I guess the one option could be to just bring the whole thing down, right? Like if in shooting it, the photographer had framed it with more sky in the frame. That goes back to the composition, right? So if I select this with the crop tool, there's actually an overlay with the crop tool where I can see the rule of thirds. So if I click on this now, you can see this is dividing the frame now into those thirds that we talked about. And the horizon is actually quite close to the rule of thirds, right, in this case. So my assumption, in fact, let me go look real quick and just see on this one. If there was, okay, so there wasn't a comment on this one. I was going to see if there was a comment on the composition because some of you guys, I mentioned in class that if you guys will put in the comments how you're applying the specific principle that we talked about in class in the picture, that's useful. And so I was just going back to see if this one had a comment, but this one didn't. So yeah, so let me look at the other comments really quick. So just think it would help the focus to be drawn to the blade of grass that are the subject. Yeah, so again, Mason's just following up with his comment, right? You can tell the subject is the depth of field is too shallow. Just my opinion. Yeah, so we kind of talked about that, right? It's hard to know exactly what we're looking at here. This is one of those things that you could go in Photoshop and you can start to mess with and really do some other things to isolate this blade of grass. So you could pick this blade of grass itself and say, well, okay, maybe if we make this part really dark and then this part behind it really bright, and then we make this, like we isolate this adjustment specific to this blade of grass, we could kind of make this feel more, this one blade feel more contrasty because we want to make sure it's clear that it's the focal point. This wouldn't necessarily be the best way to select this, but it'll demonstrate the example quickly. So if I come in here with the pen tool and just kind of make a quick selection around this, I could say, let's constrain our effect of increased contrast to this blade of grass. And now you can see that blade stands out quite a bit more because we're starting to increase contrast here relative to the surroundings, right? So yeah, so you can make this the focal point, and maybe again, you could make the legitimate argument that this shot isn't necessarily supposed to have a focal point. It's supposed to be abstract enough that it's just kind of a, like, I don't know, like I say, I think of it as a wallpaper or desktop at that point. Okay, So yeah, we can critique yours too, Olivia. We're already running out of time. I never get all the stuff done I want to. So let's go over this one, and then we'll save the other 4, and we'll pick them up tomorrow in class. So we'll talk about this one, and then we'll call it good. Okay, so this one does have some comments. So let me pull those up really quick. And I think it's helpful to read what the photographer says before me spouting off my stuff. So this one, this person says, I messed around with aperture and applied the rule of thirds to this piece. I had a blast and I liked how it turned out. So yeah, so the rule of thirds. So again, if we open up our little crop tool, you can see the intersection of those crop points, and you can see that it's falling about right here, right on the dog's nose. I think this is a really cool idea to play with this juxtaposition, right, of the ball and the dog, because I love this idea, just sort of philosophically, I guess, that we're looking at the dog who's looking at the ball. Like, there's just something really fun about that it's like we see the dog seeing something else. I love taking pictures of people taking pictures. And this kind of reminds me of that, right? That the dog's attention is somewhere else, and it's kind of looking at the camera, but it's actually looking at this massive thing in the frame right here that's just in front of us. So I feel the thing I like about this is I feel like it's starting to tell a story. And a lot of what I kind of mentioned, I think, before in this class, is that it starts to become a challenge with photography of how can I make something more than just a pretty picture or an aesthetically valuable picture? How can I actually start to incorporate storytelling or mood or emotion or theme into a picture? And I feel like this goes it starts going in that direction quite strongly. So technically, like as far as the image itself, it has like the quality isn't awesome, right? Like this doesn't look like the latest and greatest DSLR shot, right? You have compression and noise reduction stuff in here that kind of makes it fall apart a little bit that way. But I always find myself overlooking that stuff quite quickly when there's some sort of kind of thematic interest or some sort of story being told. So as far as the composition of it, I think the dog, I do like seeing the dog's eye and face right here. He gets a little bit lost over here on this side. So let me turn on a new layer so I can kind of circle stuff. So having any type of more detail here I think would be helpful, but it is a tricky exposure to balance, especially shooting on a camera like this one. And I think this gets a little bit tough to have this ball be quite this out of focus. I think in my sort of aesthetic preference, I think would be to have this be a little bit more in focus so it's not quite so large. Like when I look at this here, this ball is kind of like so fully consuming. It's like a sun here in the front of the frame, right? And with the dog staring at it back here, I see the ball and then I kind of feel like I have to look past it to see the dog. And I think having a little bit less depth of field to where this was softer than the dog focus-wise, but it was more easily recognizable as a ball, I think would make it feel less like it's encroaching on the dog. There's just not a lot of space between the two right here. And it kind of feels like it's super tight in the frame in this area where you have a lot of negative space in these other areas. And even, so we'll look at this, another one of you guys that submitted talked about intentionally cropping to a square because the composition felt better. So even this one, like if I go here 1:1 and make this a perfect square, even something like this almost starts to feel more interesting to me compositionally because I don't have all that wasted space. And then when we talk about kind of fixing some compositional stuff inside Photoshop, even getting rid of little details like this can be fairly useful. So like this little bit of the couch or cushion or whatever that was that kind of goes back there, like just cleaning things up a little bit that way. This starts to feel more like a structured and intentional, kind of artistically intentional shot. Whereas the other kind of feels like there's a lot of empty space and then a little bit of tight composition in the middle. So that being said, it's very difficult to take a picture of a dog and a ball and even get a usable expression on the dog, right? Like I said before, it's like taking pictures of kids. So I think the fact that the photographer here achieved the animal looking at the ball and having a decent composition and all that is actually quite laudable. And it's a really fun shot. So that's all we have time for right now, but we will see you guys tomorrow and we'll pick up this critique where we left off. So thank you for joining in. If you want to send me the word dog just send me an email with the word dog, and we'll give you points for sticking around. Thanks, you guys. I have to wait like the 40 seconds for the stream to finish itself out. I look so funny. I'm not used to seeing myself on camera, and then I watch it play back, and
I
I'm like,
don't know how you do it. Like, I would be so distracted by myself.
It's just you do like stupid stuff that you don't realize you do, you know? Like I look at it and I'm like, what am I doing with my head?
So out of all of the pictures that you got, did you actually have like one that you really liked? Like, was your favorite? And I don't expect
So there was this one of somebody walking on train tracks.